One of the aspects is to look, where is a person standing at? What are the influences that are working for this person in the life surroundings, in the workspace, and how does the person adapt or react to these influences? This is one of the principles why the S Drive and its report have been developed, to look not only at the influences as such, but how to optimize them for the person in their own individual situation, to reach a better well-being on the level of a cell. So therefore, the name cell well-being derives from that, how to put these cells, how to put the organism, which is actually a town. It's not an entity. It's actually a town of many different inhabitants, how they can live well and how they can be supported most optimal. A traditional way to look at things, also in medicine often, is to look at cause and effect. So it would be a cause leading to an effect. It's a nice way of simplifying things, and we try to make things a little bit more haptic in this world. But simplification often isn't the answer, because actually we are different from that, meaning we are the sum of many influences at this present time, meaning the current influences and the influences that that we were exposed to in the past. So therefore, it's a cybernetic perspective. Cybernetic is actually older than the internet. It refers to a multifactorial picture. So therefore, you can do a little bit of reading on that. There have been some people actually paving the way for this kind of a concept, like Frederick Fester and other people, showing it's important to look at the conjunction of factors. And all from therapy, very rarely it's just one factor that's responsible. Most of the time it's many factors, and the question is which are the strongest and which aren't. And that's one big advantage of the S Drive, that actually lists things in priorities, helping to understand what is important and what is important now and maybe later, meaning the story behind the story. So these individual epigenetical influences are important for an individual treatment. It is important that's how I work. It's not trying to shove a person into some drawer saying, okay, this is diagnosis number 32, and everything should be done under that regimen. I dislike that perspective. I think it's very important to understand and see that any person coming through the door is an absolutely individual case in this world, unique. And so it's important to understand the factors leading to the current situation. The S Drive is not intended to be a replacement for laboratory results. It never has, and it never will. The S Drive is thought and its report to help in the decision process, and also to expand the horizon so things can be seen from a different perspective, and also some influences then can be noticed that might have been overseen. So laboratory results they're powerful. You can do a whole lot of things in laboratory. Some laboratories go far beyond that if you know them and if you know what you're looking for, which is superb. But still, it's a static picture. It's a static picture of now, especially mainly out of the blood compartment, meaning the laboratory results only partially looks what's going on inside the cells, inside the connective tissue, inside the central nervous system. That's a lack. And therefore, it's interesting to see, okay, what does that mean for the entire body? And also, what are the dynamics behind that? So therefore, using the S drive, um, you are asking an intelligent system, which is your body and its body information field, being asked by another intelligent system using the S drive with quantum technology, to give a response, meaning the S drive helps the body to get a voice. It gives the body a voice. Normally, values are compared to normatives. That's why a Gaussian curve is here in the background. But the S drive expands that view into individual results, meaning being confronted with a certain information and then seeing what the response in the quantum field is on that subject. It might be normal, or not very um, um, not very prominent. It might be very weak, and it might be very strong. And so therefore, it's possible to deduct the intensity in which this subject is relevant for the person. In talking with patients, it is important to also give them an emotional access. And if, as a doctor, as a therapist, as an advisor, as an instructor, whatever, if you just sit there and say, well, I know all the answers and you're going to have to follow them, most people will have a gut reaction saying, who is this guy telling me this? But if you build a bridge saying, okay, this is you, this is the status of your body, this is what you are at, then it helps them to go over that bridge and saying, okay, so if this is me now, how can I change it to optimize it? How can I change it so I feel better about it? That's, I think, a very important point. And in fact, you will notice that any one of you working with the S drive then will have people calling in saying, okay, the 90 days are over. I want to have a new test to see how well I progressed, what has changed, and how far have I optimized my system. So this quantum measurement helps in the decision process and also in focusing and prioritizing therapies. It's an indicator. It's not a lab value. That's why it doesn't have decimals. It's an indicator which directs the focus into certain fields. So let me talk about the idea of the so-called quantum field. Now, we are actually in lack of many expressions because they are concepts, they are defined correlations, but still to this day, the physics and medicine and biology have not purely adapted these concepts into their realm. So therefore, I would like to sort of circumscribe what I'm talking about. So let's look at the model of atoms as one example. This is a classical model of atoms, meaning there are protons, there are neutrons in the nucleus, and there are electrons circling around it. Okay, that's how we basically learned it in chemistry. But actually, even this simplification is completely wrong, because there are no particles as such, and there are no orbits as such, and there is no sharply defined nucleus as such. Actually, we're talking about fields, and we're talking about the likeliness of a certain charge in a certain area, region, and that's one jump that quantum physics really provided, is to give a dynamic into the static picture. And in fact, going down into the elementary particles like a proton, even that one is deriving from 3 quarks, including gluons. So therefore, this model, nice, but too simple. So looking at it in a quantum view, this picture has evolved from time to time, as you see from Dalton to Schrödinger. There had been a change, and even nowadays, there's obviously more information and even wider concepts of it. So why am I talking about fields? Fields are an enormously powerful way of looking at things, because if you break down, and often in my lectures, I'm being asked, well, how do you see the body? What is the body like? Is it more like biological? Is it more chemical? Is it biochemical? What is it? How would you describe it? And my answer to that is saying mainly the body is electric, because we are dealing with different membrane potentials. We're talking about the conducing information with electrons, with electricity in nerves, for example. We are talking about field differences over the inner membrane of the mitochondria to produce ATP. And we're talking about antioxidants. What are we talking about? Antioxidants are donators for electrons. And in fact, most of this is all about exchanging electrons. So it's very important to understand this concept of the body electric and expanding the traditional view of what the body works like and how it functions. So for example, looking at the membrane potential, which can be, by the way, largely influenced nowadays because many people have an intracellular lack of potassium, and therefore the cell membrane potential is not proper, meaning you have a problem of transporting elements in and out of the cell, for example. That has to do because as soon as you take in sugar into the cell, obviously insulin has to be present, and at the same time for its receptors, and at the same time chromium has to be present at this process. And the moment the glucose is imported into the cell, 2 potassium ions are being expelled out of the cell. And so obviously with our very sugar-rich diet, that's an issue. Another example would be the inner membrane of the mitochondria, as I just mentioned it, with its different cycles, and depending on the exchange of hydrogen ions. So taking all of this together, there are some concepts which should be taken into medicine which have partially been heard, but there's still a lot of headway on that one. Headspace, I'm sorry. A lot to gain. The one is quantum physics, and the other one is actually mathematics as well, because we are talking about proportions a lot, and proportions also refer to a certain form of scale, meaning units, and some units and some underlying principles are very natural, and they reflect they resonate the natural principle. Others are not. So in this concept, the idea of so-called fractal mathematics or fractal geometry applies a lot. Here we see one example, Romanesco, which is a vegetable, as a complete and proper 3-dimensional graph of the Fibonacci series. So we find these underlying principles in many ways, like in how algae are built up in their in their form. We see magnetic and field properties, for example, in cells dividing. If they multiply, they actually follow magnetic fields, although there are no magnets involved here. And if we look at properties of waves and frequencies, actually frequencies and information generate forms. This is an example of the so-called Chladni plate, in which sound and vibration are applied onto sand or iron particles. And according to the sound and the frequency, they will collect together in certain patterns and forms according to the different frequencies. And this actually applies too for the body. So therefore, frequencies and information play a lot of role. This, for example, is the depiction on the Chladni plate of a human voice in A major. So sound generates forms, and at the same time, form also contains frequency and information. And then this is part of the link why the S drive detects information in the bioinformation field to look where a person is at. And frequencies do have a significant impact onto living processes. One example here would be a cell phone sending and vibrating due to a call, which changes the behavior of ants. Now it's ringing, and see how they change their behavior according to the frequencies. The same applies to us as well. It's just that we're a little bit more sturdy and a little bit more hard to move, but it does have an influence on us, and therefore has a significance for life. Something that Tesla actually already sketched out as an underlying principle for the universe. So hooking together mathematics and physics and natural properties, we find these properties in many ways, and it doesn't matter at which scale. Obviously, on the left, we have a galaxy. We have shells of animals, and they all follow certain properties which are repeated, partially following the golden ratio, partially following other properties. And this I could go on for an 8-hour lecture on that one because I love it, but I'm going to have to keep it short here. It's important to see how these properties have an effect on the body and the living organism. Let me show you one example of this quantum field or this quantum information in living organisms. One example would be what's called a Kirlian photography developed by a Russian named Kirlian, where you have a high voltage but low ampere field. And in this field, there are discharges, and therefore you can see some of this bioinformation field in plants and in animals and in humans. So this is an exemplary device for this. And this is what these pictures look like. And I think you can actually identify it. It's actually a slice of lemon. And on the outside, you see a radiance from this field. And this is part of the bioinformation field. Same is true for a leaf here, for example. And you see that at its tip, there is a stronger emission of energy. Professor Popp, who I know personally, actually founded a group of together with him on a discussion group, referred to them as so-called biophotons. And you can actually compare organic, well-raised apple on the right side to a piece of meat on the left. Obviously, in terms of energy, there is quite a significant difference. The same is true if you compare happy egg to one, from the factory. If you can compare conventional to organic broccoli, etc., etc., these things are just repeated. And in fact, you can even compare the tip of a finger from an ill person on the left side to a healthy person, which is very radiant on the right side. So this is one way to show and depict the bioinformation field. And we are also, of course, under external influences as well. For example, from cell phones, which is a very modern example, but there are many others that also play a role. Just to show you a few examples, which is, of course, also true on the emotional level, which is true also for the immune reactions, meaning how you feel influences your immune reactions, and your immune reactions also influence how you feel. At the level of the immune regulation, you can see this on the basis of cytokines. So therefore, it is important to see, how can I support a person that they feel better, that they feel lighter, that they are charged with more energy? And of course, it would be super to eat extremely healthy, because this would support us dramatically. But at the same time, we also have the burden of being either exposed to toxins or under a lack of certain elements, especially if people suffering from leaky gut, for example, do not have a proper resorption. So reality often looks a little bit different than it should be wished for. And that's how people feel. And you see by the mouth expression, that's also how they talk at the same time. So how can we change that? How can we detect that? How can we put that into a form? How can we detect that? Well, the idea is here, and that's how the S drive works. You use a sample of hair with follicles to have a representation of the body information field, which means a follicle contains tissue, it contains some blood, it contains some lymph, it contains connective tissue, it represents some outside skin, and the hair contains history, because the hair stores history before that. Taking that as an example is the representation for the body information field, and therefore you can detect the influences present for this person. But it should be fresh enough that the analysis should be done preferably within 3 days, because otherwise the information decays. Later on, you can still do measurements, but the accuracy, the earlier the measurement is, the more accuracy you have. So the S-Drive helps you to draw up your constellation, and it then follows up ideally every 90 days to see the story behind the story, to see the progression, to see the changes, and therefore adapting what you do also in therapy according to these indicators.